are Pro Cannabis Media.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again to another edition of In the Weeds with Jimmy Young, our regularly scheduled interview show that we produce here pretty much weekly on the Pro Cannabis Media Network. As you know, we like you to like, share, and subscribe, not just to this show, but all the original programs that we live stream and share with you, the audience, on a weekly basis. And now a 24/7 live streaming experience on our website, procannabismedia.com. That's in addition to the PCM TV streaming channel on Roku and your Apple streaming channel applications that are out there. I'm so excited to be talking to a guest today because in a lot of ways, I like to think of myself at least as an amateur professor at the college ranks. I teach at Curry College, Dean College, Emerson College in the greater Boston area. This year, I'm back in the classroom to teach my Introduction to Sportscasting course. And I always find it a little awkward, especially when the kids ask me, "Hey, Jimmy, what are you doing now?" I said, well, I built a media company about the cannabis industry. And of course, that gets your giggles. Joining me now to talk a little bit about the sociology of cannabis, if you will, the stigma, the challenges, and the role that this plant has played in our society for hundreds of years, if you know anything about the history. His name is Phil Lamy. He is with the Vermont University at Castleton. That's in Castleton, Vermont. And Phil, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Well, you're welcome, Jimmy. Thanks for having me.
And tell us a little bit about the course that you teach there and what are the elements of is it the sociology of cannabis?
Well, what we have is we just completed our third year of a program. It's a 12-credit program called the Cannabis Studies Certificate Program, in which there are 3 basic courses and then an internship. The courses are a course in cultivation called Cannabis Cultivation and Care. And we have a course in business, Canno Business. And then I teach kind of the survey course called Cannabis Culture and Consciousness, which covers the 14,000-year history of humans and cannabis.
And is there a textbook you use, just out of curiosity?
I do. I use it's actually such a great time to be teaching a course on cannabis right now because it's happening, right? It's in the news. There's so much to draw from the internet, from what's going on from state to state. So that part is easy. But I do use one textbook. I have it right here, as a matter of fact. It's called Cannabis History by Martin Booth, the late Martin Booth, who was a British journalist. The book was published in 2004, I believe. So it's a little old, maybe a little bit outdated in terms of the last 15 or so years. But I've read just about every history of cannabis, and this is the best one. I highly recommend it. Cannabis History. And It's just highly detailed. It's a good read. It's rich. It's deep. And there are a lot of surprising things in there, even for me.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of learning and reading. You're always going to learn something for the most part, especially if you're reading nonfiction, and especially in the cannabis space, because, you know, it's funny you said it was published, I think you said 2004.
Correct.
I just read a book that was written in 2020, that was published in 2020, that was dated. Okay. I mean, it's like, it takes a while not only to write the book, but to get it out there and published. And it's a fascinating time to be in the cannabis industry because things are happening so fast. And yet those that are in the industry, we call it cannabis time because it does take time. And we all know that there hasn't been any movement at the federal reform level at this point in time as we record this in the summer of 2022. Have you noticed that the cannabis clock, and even though we've accomplished quite a bit over the last 4 years, it's really been a long, slow process, hasn't it?
It's a long, slow process, and your comment about the changes, and those changes are going to continue on really for the next few decades. I mean, we see right now all the states that have either legalized recreational or medical marijuana, they're all different, right? And even in a state like Vermont, it's going to change as time goes by. But, you know, your comment just about the long time that this has been coming causes me to mention this point. my students, my students are like 18 to 22 for the most part. They often say to me, Professor Lamy, you know, I can't believe I'm living in a time where, marijuana is finally becoming legal. And I'm like, you can't believe it. 45 years ago when I was in college, I thought this was going to be legal by the time I graduated. So, I can't believe that it's finally happening. But I think things are speeding up. I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on, obviously at the state level in legislatures, at the federal level. I think people at the federal level are trying to make things happen, but we live in such a politically divisive age these days that even those, say, Republicans that might be, and there are a lot of them that might like to see this happen, if only for business reasons, just don't want to give Democrats the win. So I think we're stuck with political divisiveness, which is adding to the tedium and the slowness that is happening. But it's happening. I live in Vermont. October 1st, we're going to be launching retail cannabis. Hemp has been legal for several years now. There's a lot happening. And at the same time, it's a very exciting time to be in. It's like being at the start of the Industrial Revolution. There's, so many cool things that are happening, and who knows where it's going to go. But I think it's an exciting time to be alive if you're interested in cannabis culture, cannabis history, the cannabis space, as we now call it.
And as a former history major at Tufts University way back in the 70s, okay, although I refer to my major as old news, okay, because I spent 30 years in newsrooms, and we are in a historic time right now. We are in a newsworthy time right now. And it's one of the reasons why my vision of creating an army of multimedia journalists to document the end of cannabis prohibition in this country is now coming to fruition here at Pro Cannabis Media with our live stream of 24/7. And no, I agree with you. Did I ever think that I would be talking about cannabis and actually having and getting subscribers and a following now? It's a fascinating time to be in this industry. And I've met some of the coolest people, and I don't just mean cool, rock star cool, but also just people that are passionate about it in their 20s and 30s and want to be part of this industry and want to be part of history. And that is really what that's what drives me. Am I wrong? Am I out here in an island by myself, or are there others who recognize this too?
The word passion is a good one, I think, because I've seen the same thing. So many of the people that are involved in this cannabis space at the moment are people who have always been there, right? I think we use the term legacy, cannabis cultivators and people that are involved in it. I think of it in terms of a culture. One of my interest over the years as a sociologist has been in subcultures and countercultures. Like you, I came of age in the late 1960s and 70s when cannabis was such a part of that culture, that subculture, that counterculture. It's people who are passionate about it. I've seen the same thing in the conferences that I've gone to, the students that I've had, other people like yourself who are involved. This isn't, certainly there are people who are just getting into it because it's the latest thing and maybe there's some money to be made. But my experience so far is that most people involved in this culture, I like the term cannabis culture, that's always been there, that's continuing to evolve, are in it for the right reasons.
How many times have you heard cannabis has saved my life, cannabis has changed my life, amongst those that are in the industry and those that have been impacted by this plant?
I hear that all the time. I hear it from students, right? You mentioned to me earlier about talking about sports, the sports leagues, and what's happening in terms of regulations and laws and testing. It's interesting that I think our program, as you can imagine, has been very popular, particularly among the traditional age students. And I would say, and of all the courses, probably the two groups of students that seem to predominate in the class, so that we tend to have a lot of those students, are students in the health sciences, right, including nursing, right, who see the medical potential of it, and then student athletes, or those in the various forms of whether it's sports medicine, sports management, coaching, or just students who are student athletes, and they use it quite regularly. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. And I'm not just talking about smoking marijuana. I'm talking about using all kinds of products to relieve stress and pains at the end of a game or a long week of practices. And it seems to be very, very common. So They are very attuned to what's going on. They have, there's so many marijuana myths that have been out there that have been out there for decades. And most of these students, they know of that. They've got so much information at their fingertips with the internet, up-to-date information and research. They're paying attention to what's going on. And again, as you say, they're passionate about it as well. So it's once again, it's an exciting time to be talking and studying cannabis. Who would ever have thought, right, to you and I years ago, that we'd be teaching cannabis studies in college? As I like to say, it's a new era in higher education.
That's right. There's so many puns and plays on words in this industry.
That's a terrible one.
It is. It's all right. By the way, they're all pretty terrible, but they're fun. They're truly worth sharing and just saying, oh, roll your eyes and you go on. I do want to ask you a question that I haven't prepared you for. So I want to ask you this question. When I was growing up, okay, in the 60s and 70s, okay, I'm going to be 65 in a few weeks. Okay, so I'm not afraid of sharing my age with others. The drinking age, the adult age was 18, where you could actually be drafted and you could actually go drink in a bar at age 18. Now, I was blessed because when the law changed at 21, I was 21. And here I am at 65, still living to tell these stories. Mm-hmm. To me, this is all about education. There are fewer alcoholics in Europe than there are in America. And I use alcohol as an example because it's been accepted by society a lot longer than cannabis has. And yet I think everyone who looks at those two products recognizes they're both adult products. One can have a far more damaging experience, and the other, we're still learning about the experiences and the power of the anecdotal evidence of those who perhaps used it when they were 12, 13, 14, and are still using it today in their 60s, 70s, and some even in their 80s. And I'm not talking about rolling a joint and smoking. It goes back to what you said, cannabis derivatives, whether it's the CBD cannabinoid or the CBN cannabinoid. There are so many chemicals that are now being discovered because we're finally able to research this plant and look at the history of it as well. Of all of those factors, to you, what's the most interesting development as far as the acceptance of this plant as a medicine in our society?
Well, let me say, Jimmy, I'm 66 years old, so my experience was exactly the same as yours. We were always one step ahead of the curve when it went from 18 to 20 to 21.
I felt blessed. Did you feel blessed? Did you feel blessed?
I tell my students that all the time. I feel I'm so lucky, and it's ridiculous. I mean, I think we should go back to 18. To be quite frank,
yep.
Most of the rest of the developed world, it has much lower drinking ages or no drinking ages, and people are taught to drink responsibly. And there's an interesting point that's often made. Why American college students drink so irresponsibly, and the answer is because drinking responsibly is illegal. They can't do it. And the same thing holds for cannabis. It's 21. It's going to be 21 in most states, and it's probably what it will be at the federal level, just like alcohol. And I don't know about you, but my research, both in teaching this class and just reading the studies and reading the histories, most Americans began smoking marijuana, in their teens. Right. I started when I was 17, a junior in high school. Have done it ever since, and all my students, I have them do a kind of an anonymous survey at the beginning of the class to tell me about, to write down, when they first, tried cannabis. Was it marijuana? Who were you with? When did it happen? What did you do? The various ways that you use it. That's where I get all this information, with athletes saying, they use it in so many different ways. But 90% of them, and 90% of them in the classroom, have tried marijuana or have smoked marijuana, and they tried it the first time when they were, usually 15, 16, 17, either in high school or in college. Few on either end, either before that or after that. And so then we get into this whole discussion. I give them articles about this current argument that the teen adolescent brain is under such rapid development at that time, is so vulnerable to any disruption, that even smoking marijuana at that age on a regular basis can seriously injure your brain health, your memory, et cetera, your ability to be successful. And I don't know, I'm beginning to think, Jimmy, that might be a new marijuana myth. It's hard to say that, because everybody seems to believe it, right? We've got all these brain studies and brain scans and MRIs, and everybody
Right.
seems to accept, that the teen brain will be severely damaged by that. I don't know about you. I started when I was 17, and I think I'm pretty fine. I know lots of people I grew up with who are, do all kinds of things. There are other professors, doctors, lawyers, farmers, neighbors, relatives. We all started when we were in our teens, and many of us are still doing it, and we don't feel like we've been all that damaged.
Yeah, and Professor Phil with a PhD and master's next to your name. Okay, it is amazing that you have accomplished what you have, and this is one of the reasons I laugh about this. I'm leaving my body and my brain to science, okay? Because I'm going to give them a list before I die of all the things I put in my body so they can see the effect on my brain and on my liver and on my stomach and my lungs and wherever you can see when you go inside my body, which is a scary thought, to be honest with you, because it is not a temple. It's been a nightmare. And I also think at some point I was an athlete. I know I was, in fact, but I look back at my experiences and, I try to compare it with some of the stories that I hear from some of those that are have been most impacted by the failed war on drugs, the people in our cities, the African-American people, those of color, Latin America, whichever, indigenous people in our society, the groups that the white colonists, who came to this country first and touched down at Plymouth Rock, if I remember my history correct, in Massachusetts. The first thing they did was kind of put those people that were here before us in cages and slaughter them and put them into little reservations and call it a day. It's a very sad thing that the white colonist coming to this country has impacted for the power and the control of societal norms and laws. And if you look back at history, it becomes more and more apparent that race has played a huge role in our history. And cannabis has been used as a political tool to kind of maintain that. And if you look at the history of the word and of the 1937 Tax Act that basically prohibited its use and its study and its acceptance, and then of course, I'm sure Harry Anslinger was not exactly a politically correct figure, but he still was the head of the first drug, the DEA, right? So race has always played a role in the acceptance of cannabis in our society. What's your opinion about that, Mr. Doctor and Professor of Sociology? Because I tend to rant and rave as a talk show host.
Well, you're talking to a professor, so we're kind of in the same business.
I get it. Yeah.
We like to talk. There's no doubt as to the racist history of cannabis. And you point out to Harry Anslinger. If anybody's looking for an antagonist, one of the person who's probably most responsible for us, prohibiting, demonizing, criminalizing marijuana and cannabis, even non-marijuana, get high cannabis. It's Harry Anslinger. And it's a fascinating history. In the book that I mentioned, Cannabis: A History, that history is covered quite a bit. And what's interesting is that early on, Harry was not that opposed to marijuana. He didn't think it was really that big a problem until he got into a conflict with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI for funding for their agencies. And he turned to, since he couldn't do alcohol any longer, he turned to the next thing that he could, whip up money and support for, and that was marijuana. And of course, the people he targeted, as you pointed out, were ethnic minorities, including African Americans, Mexican immigrants, anybody associated with those groups, including white jazz musicians hanging out with black jazz musicians. So the tremendous racism, and it goes beyond that. The history, and you're right, outside of Western white, capitalist Christian culture, many other cultures around the world were using cannabis and other plant substances for, for largely for religious purposes, as well as medicinal purposes and social and cultural purposes, not to mention all the other things you can do with it, fiber, for example. And it really, I think it begins in a lot of ways with the British colonizing India back in the 18th and 19th century. And, seeing all these all these subjects, these Indian subjects, which of course they saw as inferior to them in terms of their culture, their religion, their history, and the kinds of traditions and rituals that they had, including around cannabis. What's interesting, one of the really interesting things to me, and stop me if I'm going on a little too long here, one of the surprising things I really picked up in this book years ago when I first read it was the number of large-scale studies on the use of cannabis. We hear all the time, even to this day, people who are opponents of cannabis who want to continue to go slow often say, well, we don't really have a lot of good research on cannabis, on its pharmaceutical, its medical, its physical, it's all these other, effects. We really don't have it. And I used to believe that as well. And of course, one of the main reasons is because the US government has forbid researchers to look into it. Unless they were looking for bad things, you couldn't look for the possible potential benefits. And I was just mentioning India, so the Indian government, the British government was so concerned about the common use by Indians in using cannabis that they set out to do a major study. What should we do about this? And somewhere here I have one of the volumes of this study. Check this out. Published in 1894. It's called the Report on the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, 1893-94. And this is one of 3 volumes, which looked at the pharmaceutical properties, the psychological effects of cannabis, the medicinal properties, how the Indians use it in terms of culture and society and religion. And they had doctors, they had sociologists, they had pharmacologists, they had psychologists. And it was like a 2-year study. And they looked at everything. It's a fantastic study, very scientific. And essentially what they found out was it's really not that big a deal. We'd probably have more problems if we outlawed this. And all the myths that they believe that it caused psychosis and people went in insane asylums and it caused murder, none of that turned out to be true, right? We still hear these things now. None of it turned out to be true. There were certain problems here and there, but the end result, the conclusion was, we'll probably cause more damage, to our control of India if we outlaw this thing. We should just leave it alone. And you know what the Indian government did? They threw it under the rug, right? Just like all the other studies that have been done over the years, including the United States. There's a famous study done in Jamaica, the Jamaican ganja study done in the middle of the 1970s. And those researchers have followed that up to this very day. And they're looking at women who, consume marijuana, laced tea while they were pregnant, children using it as medicines, the whole Rastafarian culture, the Jamaican culture. And those studies go on, and essentially they find very few serious effects of long-term cannabis use. And again, my main point here is there have been, and there are other studies. There were studies done in the 1970s in the United States, all kinds of really major studies. So that notion, that's another myth. There haven't been any real studies done on cannabis. It's not true. And I've got a long list of them that I have my students read through. If you make the argument, that we need more double-blind studies, controlled studies. Yes, that's true. We could use more of those, once the government allows that to happen more frequently.
And they're starting to.
So I'm going to stop there. Go ahead.
No, they're starting to. You brought up a lot of great points. Right. I'm behind you on 100% of most of those. You're talking about the Schaefer report, the LaGuardia report, both U.S. government studies that came to those same conclusions. One of my favorite quotes is two stats that I've learned from this woman, Dr. Uma Dhanabalan, who's a local doctor, who is probably one of the most knowledgeable people about this plant, its history, its use, how to titrate, the whole 9 yards. She said a couple of things to me at the very beginning of my interview career, if you will, for cannabis. One is that there's been already 30,000 studies of cannabis, mostly funded by the substance abuse community in the drug world, because they were looking for the negativity. There's got to be something bad. It's got to do something, there's got to be something, right? And then the other factoid I throw out there at people is the fact that back in the 20th century, between 1910 and 1900, over 5 million prescriptions for cannabis as a medicine were written by doctors who came out of NYU Med, Harvard Med, Yale Med. Yes, they had med schools back then. And yes, that was, it goes back to your first report there in the 19th century. That's what they knew. That's where they found the medicinal qualities of this plant, and they wanted to use it. They really looked into it and were using it legitimately and legally as a medicine at that time. And then look, Mr. Sociology professor here, you know where it's going, right? That they did not like the fact that who was using this as a medicine, okay? And they wanted to perpetuate the separation of the races and the sexes, I might add. And, again, this is part of the history of this plant, and enough people are starting to learn about it. But sharing that information is something that I think, and I'll quote Aaron Smith, the executive director of the NCIA, said at a recent membership drive, if we're in the industry, we're the ones who are charged with sharing this knowledge with those that have been thought that this was a horrible thing, and you could be, as soon as you start using it, you're going to become addicted to it, and all the horrible things that Reefer Madness put out there, that was again funded to stigmatize and villainize this medicinal plant. And again, I feel like that. That's why I do what I do, and that's why I appreciate having someone who grew up in the same era as I did, has the knowledge behind them as well. I do want to ask you a question about the word marijuana, because that was the word that was used it was a slang term brought in by Mexican immigrants that was loosely translated as evil weed. And it is still part of our vernacular. We're still talking about it. There's a lot of people in the industry. In fact, doctors are trying to get it out of medical journals as with the M word, getting rid of the M word and replacing it with the actual word of the plant, which is cannabis. And what's your feeling about the M word as a word that does have racial connotations and some history to it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I understand what you're saying, but as you point out, the term really is rooted in Mexican culture. It was the Mexicans who were using it. That's what they called
slang. But it was slang, right?
It was slang, right? And most of us think of it as Mary and Jane. It did attain a kind of racist connotation, right? When it was started being when it was demonized by people like Harry Anslinger, and so that's why we think of it. Well, is it a bad term to be using because it has this racist connotation? But on the other hand, I think that it's like the term Indian, right? Columbus called the Native Americans Indians. And ever since, and we say that we have the same debate, should we be using that term? But my reading of Native American culture is most Native Americans don't mind the term Indian. They use that themselves to describe, their culture. So, I don't know that that's a bad reason to throw it out. On the other hand, I think when we talk about cannabis, we are talking about different types of cannabis. There is only one species of cannabis, cannabis sativa, but there are many different forms, right? And the most diverse, of course, happen to be drug-oriented cannabis that with high levels of THC, and then cannabis that has low or no levels of THC, which we call hemp, right? So I think the common designation these days is that high THC cannabis is called marijuana. That's the one that will get you high, and the other form of cannabis, which we call hemp, right? It won't get you high. That's used for CBD. That's used for industrial purposes, for fiber. Now, neither term really, I think, is technically or scientifically correct. A lot of the books I have, the one I was just showing you, including the Schaefer report, the LaGuardia report, what's it? Let's see, I want to see another great book I have here I would recommend to people called Cannabis, Evolution and Ethnobotany. If you really want to deep dive into the chemical, the botanical, the historical roots of this plant. This is written by two, ethnobotanists. These are anthropologists to study the human relationship with plants, including and they're cannabis experts. And throughout the book, and this is a fairly recent book, this is an up-to-date, these are the scientists, and they use the term hemp to describe cannabis.
Right.
Right. And they make a distinction, as I just made. So when they're talking about what we call marijuana, they talk about, cannabis drug THC.
Yep.
In other words, they call it, but the cannabis drug, it's high in THC, as opposed to, hemp forms of cannabis, which have very low levels of THC. So it's interesting, and years ago, hemp was the term that was used to describe all forms of cannabis. So what I think is important for people to know who don't know this, a lot of people think there are multiple, species of cannabis, right? Indica, sativa, ruderalis. And there's not. There's only one species, according to most scientists, including these guys. It's cannabis sativa. And what we call indica was when cannabis moved west into places like India and Nepal, and it settled there, became cultivated there, evolved in that environment, that climate, and those soils, and used in those cultures. It became what we tend to call indica or indica dominant. So there's still a lot of confusion about the terms, Jimmy. I don't know where it's going to end up. I think we have made progress. Most people know the term cannabis. I talked to some old timers older than us who say, cannabis, what's that? That's a politically correct term. It's called marijuana. And I try to tell, well, marijuana is one form. There's lots of other kinds of things. So cannabis is the term I think most people are using now. The term cannabis studies, which you use, is now a kind of a universal term used by anybody that's studying it, whether it's the natural history of it or the social and cultural history of it. Cannabis studies, and now we're trying to make a distinction between the different types, chemotypes or of the plant.
Why do we have to label everything? Why do we have to label everything? Because everybody immediately has a profile or a stereotype or something that comes to your mind when you say certain words. What is that, just a human behavior thing? Or should I ask a psychiatrist that or a psychologist that?
Well, I've studied linguistics as well, entomology, the history of words. Well, we're humans. We have to call something, right? We can't call it nothing. It's got to be something. But those terms change. I mean, some critics call it political correctness, but I think sometimes, the terms that are racist, or hurtful or sexist in the past, once we identify that they are, and they are harmful, I don't see a problem with the word changing. And it's not like someone says, okay, this term is racist or sexist. We have to change it. It evolves, right? And we're in, just as we've been talking, we're in this evolutionary stage in terms of cannabis becoming more and more a part of our culture. And we're having to deal with all kinds of things. The debates are still there. And here's one of them. What do we actually call this thing?
Right. It evolves.
Even the term strain, right? Everybody uses the term strain. I read fairly recently that according to horticulturists and botanists, plant scientists, there's no such thing as strains.
Correct.
In plants,
these are called genetics now. They're genetics.
Yeah,
you know that, right?
Chemotypes is the
term. I used to clean the genetics on an album cover. I don't know about you, right? Right, but that's what I used to. Right? I mean, come on. I mean,
genetics. Yeah.
We've been there. We've played with the herb. We've played with the plant. It is it's, first of all, it's great to talk with an age appropriate person that's educated about cannabis. I just want to throw that out there. I've enjoyed this a lot, and I know I could keep going and deeper on this, but I do want to kind of wrap it up. But before I do this, all right, I want you to tell me a little bit, tell our audience a little bit about the university that you're in, where you teach this. I know we talked a little bit at the beginning, but I actually have to walk out of frame so my man Dan can punch you up full, and you can explain a little bit about where people could find out more about the Castleton University and its curriculum about cannabis.
Sure.
Tell us.
Okay. Well, I wanted to say one thing. You mentioned social equity at the beginning of our last discussion. And I do want to say that, of course, that's happening, right? I think almost every state that is looking at legalizing cannabis or medically or adult use is concerned with social equity and those kinds of issues. And we are as well. And I'm excited to report that fairly recently, the Vermont Cannabis Control Board has contracted with Castleton University and our program, Cannabis Studies Certificate Program, to provide education as a kind of social equity opportunity or benefit to those. So we're going to be this fall. We're going to be taking in our first students from recommended by the Vermont Cannabis Control Board to take our courses, beginning with our business course. They believe that business is one of the things that a lot of these applicants are going to require. But for anybody who's interested in the program, it's easy enough. The program is called Castleton University's Cannabis Studies Certificate Program. And if you just go to castleton.edu, you'll come on to the Castleton website. And if you just go up into the upper window, one of the search windows there, and just type in cannabis studies, and it'll give you several links to our webpage on the Castleton website. And as simple as that. People are certainly welcome to contact me. My information, my phone number, my email address is there if anybody's interested in courses. This fall, beginning next week, 2 of the courses will be offered. Mine, called Cannabis, Culture, and Consciousness, is offered both in class and online, so students can take it online. And the Cannabis Business class is also offered online in a synchronous format. So there are classes, but they're online. Our cultivation class will be offered this spring semester. And then internships happen all year round at any particular time. We also offer all of the courses, the entire program, in the summertime.
So you mentioned a couple of the books, and I love the fact that you have them within arm's length. My arm would have to be about 10 feet long to get this book, but it is one that I just read, and I want to give a plug to this author, but I also want to give plugs to 2 other books that I read after I got my medical card in 2013 as part of the Massachusetts program, because I've had four major surgeries in 22 years to my body. My body's riddled with arthritis, blah, 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 blah. You don't want me to talk about my body, please. If you really want a reason why I'm as wacky as I am, I got dropped on my head when I was like 6 years old by a babysitter. Okay. And since then, it's been all downhill. No, I'm only kidding. This is my story. The Cannabis Manifesto by Steve D'Angelo, who, of course, is the founder of the Last Prisoner Project. That is something that is a must read, I believe, for anybody that's interested in this industry, because he talks about his own personal experience. He talks about it through growing up on the East Coast and ending up in California and becoming an advocate and helping to legalize it as a medicinal plant in the mid-90s. So, he's been in the trenches for many, many years. He kind of looks like Willie Nelson. He's got the 2 pigtails and he wears a little hat, and he's really a cool guy. Met him, interviewed him, really enjoy him. And the other is Bruce Barcott, who's the editor of Leafly. He wrote Weed the People, which is also a documentary that I recommend. Those are great pieces of media that can be shared with others, watched. I believe everything's on demand. You can get any piece of media you want if you just look for it and Google it. Everybody knows that. But this is a new book, okay? And it's written by a young man named Taras Batista, who is a former college athlete at Georgia State University. He's African-American. He was drafted by the Atlanta Falcons in the 7th round. He had a cup of coffee in training camp, and that was pretty much his professional career. But I've since gotten to know Taras a little bit, and he sent me his book, and I read his book. And people, I'm telling you, I couldn't put it down because it was only 110 pages long. Okay, let's cut to the chase. It was a very quick read. But what is in here is one person's journey with this plant since age 12. And it's told from a African-American perspective and experience, and as an athlete. And I can totally relate to the things that he shared about how the plant and the cannabis had consumed him in his years, let's say between 12 and 25. And then, of course, he became enlightened and learned more about it and really researched what was going on in this advocacy movement, and talked with both sides of this argument. And there's plenty of them out there, and I'm not going to name names, but the point is, this is about the emotional journey that the plant has played with a young man and how he got involved with it. Peer pressure, anti-inflammatory, didn't want to do opioids, so he used it as an anti-inflammatory. The whole experience is in this book. And basically the title is Don't Let It Smoke You: Creating a Non-Toxic Relationship with Cannabis. which basically means don't let it consume your life. It's what we preach here at Pro Cannabis Media. We preach about responsible use, getting educated, taking the professor's class, learning about it, engrossing yourself in some articles that you will find and be enlightened about what this plant does, how it works, the effect on the endocannabinoid system that's in every mammal. Okay. Even little Wabbit running around the yard there, he's got a little endocannabinoid system. Learn about what is going on in it and the genetics. We talked a little bit about the seeds and the steering mechanisms that are with this cannabis plant, whether it's a sativa, indica. It's the terpenes that drive the bus on the genetics and can impact what this plant does to you, whether it's a focus or it's a anti-anxiety or it's anti-seizure or it's anti-inflammatory. It's a fascinating time to be in this industry. So, Dr. Phil Lamy, thank you so much for joining us here today on In the Weeds. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I hope you enjoyed listening to some of my rants, because that's kind of my style.
No, thank you, Jimmy, very much. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun and hope to do it again.
Remember, everybody, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Use it responsibly. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.
Hey, you want to grow your own plants? Check out Style Lighting's Grow Kit. It has everything you need to become an expert home grower and bring the power of the sun indoors. Style Lighting uses TCP's high-powered commercial LEDs that deliver twice the output in the market. The Grow Kit has a grow bag, a timer, chains to hang the light, and of course the best in the business lighting system by TCP. Check out stylelighting.shop for more information.
Weed Talk and In the Weeds are two productions of Pro Cannabis Media supported by Revolutionary Clinics, one of the top medical cannabis dispensaries in the Massachusetts area, now with 3 locations in Greater Boston, 2 in Cambridge and 1 on Broadway in Somerville. Rev Clinics has a patient-first mission. They will customize your needs as a medical patient with the proper titration and combination of strains, flavors, and products. Rev Clinics, where the patient comes first.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.